I stepped off the plane at Seattle-Tacoma Airport as the fiery sunset began to fade, painting the sky in blazing shades of orange. For 4 long months, from the opulent auditoriums of Paris to the crowded lecture halls of Tokyo, Marvin Monroe, 35, an inspirational speaker, had spoken about dreams, overcoming adversity, and living a meaningful life. But now, as my suitcase rumbled behind me, I wanted only one thing: to go home, embrace my parents, and tell them about the days I'd lived through. Before embarking on my tour, I'd bought them a penthouse at the Mirren Residences, Seattle's most luxurious building. It was my gift to them, a way to make up for the difficult years our family had endured. I pictured my father sitting by the window, reading the newspaper through his old glasses, while my mother bustled in the kitchen, baking the cookies I'd loved since childhood. But life, as I was about to discover, never unfolds quite as we imagine. I rented a car at the airport, foregoing the private driver I usually hired. I wanted to drive myself, to feel the road leading me home. Seattle unfolded through the car window, skyscrapers aglow with lights, bustling crowds, and the faint scent of the sea drifting in from Puget Sound. I smiled at the thought of the Penthouse, perched on the top floor of the Mirren with its sweeping views of the city. I'd spent a year choosing that place, ensuring my parents would have a comfortable life, free from worries about bills or the leaky roof of our old wooden house in Spokane. I pressed the accelerator, my heart pounding with anticipation. 4 months away from home was too long, and I couldn't wait to see my mother's smile or hear my father's warm, steady voice. When I pulled up to the building, the golden glow from the lobby spilled out, warm as a greeting. I dragged my suitcase through the large glass doors and nodded to the security guard behind the reception desk. "Welcome back, Mr. Monroe," he said with a friendly smile. I returned the smile, but inside I was eager to get upstairs. The elevator dinged softly, carrying me to the 42nd floor. The plush hallway was carpeted in red, with the faint scent of lavender wafting from a diffuser. I stopped in front of the apartment door, my heart beating faster. I knocked 3 times, crisp and clear, and waited. I imagined my mother opening the door, her eyes lighting up at the sight of me, or my father ambling out, pretending to grumble about my late arrival. But when the door swung open, I froze. It wasn't my father or my mother standing there. It was Silas, my younger brother. He wore a wrinkled t-shirt, his hair disheveled, his eyes squinting as if trying to figure out why I was standing there. Behind him, in the open kitchen, Heather, Silas's wife, was setting a plate of toast on the table. She glanced up, her eyes flicking over me before she smiled, a smile devoid of any warmth. A chill ran down my spine despite the brightly lit room. "Silas," I said, my voice hoarse with surprise. "What are you doing here?" Silas shrugged, his hand still gripping the door as if controlling access. "Oh, you're back? Welcome home?" His tone was light, but there was something insincere about it, like he was playing a role in a script I hadn't read. I stepped over the threshold, pulling my suitcase inside, my eyes scanning the apartment. Everything was pristine. Too pristine. The white leather sofa I'd bought for my parents gleamed, not a scratch on it. The walnut dining table sparkled as if freshly polished. The abstract paintings I'd chosen still hung on the walls, but the room lacked the soul I'd expected. No smell of my mother's cookies, no rustle of my father's newspaper. It felt like a model home, beautiful but lifeless. "Where are Mom and Dad?" I asked, my voice hardening. I tried to stay calm, but a bad feeling was rising, like a tidal wave building beneath the surface. Silas shrugged again, a gesture I'd hated since we were kids because it always meant indifference. "Oh, they weren't comfortable in a fancy place like this. They said it was too stifling, so they went back to Spokane." He spoke casually, as if describing a weekend trip. His words hit me like a thunderbolt. I stood rooted to the spot, the floor seeming to crumble beneath me. "Back to Spokane," I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. "This apartment, I bought it for them. They loved this place. Mom even talked about planting flowers on the balcony." Heather stepped forward, placing a hand on Silas's shoulder, her gaze sliding over me. "That's right, Marvin," she said, her voice saccharine but laced with calculation. "They said they weren't used to city life. Too noisy, too modern. They preferred the quiet of Spokane. I looked at her, then at Silas. They stood there, confident, as if this were their home, as if my presence were an intrusion. My chest burned with a mix of anger and confusion. My father, Isaac Monroe, 63, the man who'd painstakingly fixed every electrical outlet to provide for us, never complained about anything I did for him. My mother, Eloise, the gentle woman with the warmest smile, had cried when I first showed her this penthouse. They couldn't have simply not adjusted and left. When did they leave? I asked, struggling to keep my voice steady, though my hand tightened around the suitcase handle. A few weeks after you left for your tour, Silas replied, his tone still infuriatingly even. They decided on their own, man. We didn't push them. I wanted to scream, to grab Silas by the collar and demand real answers. But I knew shouting wouldn't solve anything. I looked around again, my gaze landing on a small photo on the shelf. The only family picture I'd left behind, taken during a picnic in Spokane when I was a kid. It was now tilted, nearly obscured by an expensive vase. My heart clenched. Fine, I said, my voice cold as ice. I turned, dragging my suitcase out of the apartment without looking back at Silas or Heather. The door slammed shut behind me, the sound echoing in the silent hallway. As the elevator carried me back to the lobby, my mind reeled. Silas's words echoed in my head. They weren't comfortable in a fancy place like this. No, that wasn't right. My parents weren't the type to leave without a word. They'd never let me worry, never leave me guessing about what was happening. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. I stepped out of the building, Seattle's cold air slapping my face. I opened the car door, tossed my suitcase into the back, and slid into the driver's seat. The engine roared as I hit the gas, heading straight for Spokane. It was a drive of over 4 hours, but I didn't care. I needed the truth, and I knew it was waiting for me there, where I was born, where it all began. The highway to Spokane stretched out before me, and I pressed the accelerator. The engine's roar blending with the whistle of wind through the slightly open window. The scent of damp earth wafted in from the rain that had just stopped, pulling me back to old days, to memories I thought had faded beneath the glow of success. But no, they were still there, vivid and sharp, like carvings etched into the wood of our old house on the outskirts of Spokane. That wooden house, small and rickety, nestled in a field of wild grass, was where I grew up. My father, Isaac Monroe, 63, used to spend entire days in a corner of the kitchen, hunched over a workbench cluttered with wires, bulbs, and outlets. His hands were calloused, marked with tiny scars from electric shocks or slips of the knife. I still remember his grumbling when a bulb refused to light, but then, once he'd fixed it, he'd turn to me with a tired but proud smile. "See, Marvin," he'd say, "everything can be fixed if you don't give up." I'd sit nearby, a 10-year-old boy, looking at my father like he was a hero, even if the world only knew him as a poor electrician. My mother, Eloise, 60, was the heart of that house. Every morning before the dawn's light fully broke, she'd be up, quietly packing lunchboxes for me and Silas before we headed to school. Those lunches were nothing fancy, usually just a sandwich with some sliced apples or deli meat. But I'd always find a small note tucked inside, her simple handwriting saying, "Study well, my boy." Mom never said much, but every gesture, every action carried a love I only understood when I grew older. I remember the afternoons when she'd sit by the window, sunlight filtering through thin curtains, illuminating her silver-streaked hair. She'd mend my torn shirts, each stitch slow and careful, as if it were the most important task in the world. Those memories flooded back, like an old film playing slowly in my mind. I saw the wooden house again, its creaking floorboards groaning under my running steps, the smell of damp wood and the cheap coffee Mom brewed every morning. Despite the poverty, despite counting every penny to pay the bills, that house was always filled with laughter. Dad told corny jokes, Mom pretended to grumble but ended up laughing too. Silas, back then just a mischievous kid, would knock over glasses or break plates, but no one scolded him. We had each other, and that was enough. Rain began to fall, small droplets streaking down the windshield. I turned on the wipers, but their rhythmic swish-swish only heightened my unease. I thought about Silas, about Heather, about the eerily pristine penthouse. Silas, my younger brother, used to be a sharp-witted kid who could make anyone laugh. But as he grew up, he changed. Failed sales jobs, mounting debts, and Heather, his wife, whom I never truly understood. She always smiled, always said the right things, but her eyes, cold and calculating, never made me feel at ease. What were they doing in the penthouse? Why had my parents left? And why hadn't anyone told me? As I entered the outskirts of Spokane, the city lights gave way to familiar country roads. The old wooden house materialized in my mind, with its chipped wooden fence and the gnarled apple tree Silas once climbed and fell from. I wondered if the house was still the same or if it too had changed, like what seemed to be happening to my family. I pressed the gas harder, determined to close the distance. Spokane wasn't far now, but every passing second felt like a test. I needed to know where my parents were, and I needed to know now. As I turned into the narrow lane leading to our family's old wooden house, my heart seemed to stop. The house stood silent, shrouded in darkness. No lights, no smoke from the chimney, no sign of life. I parked the car, turned off the engine, and sat there, staring at the weathered wooden door that had once been the heart of our home. I stepped out of the car, my shoes crunching on the gravel path. A cold wind swept through, carrying the scent of damp earth and grass. I approached the door, my hand trembling as it touched the doorknob. I knocked, 3 sharp raps that echoed in the stillness. No answer. I knocked harder, calling out, "Dad? Mom? Is anyone home?" My voice sounded hollow, carried away by the wind. I pushed the door, but it was locked. Through the murky glass pane, I saw only darkness inside. This house, once filled with laughter and warmth, now felt like an empty shell. My chest tightened, a nameless fear gripping my throat. I turned to the house next door where Mrs. Wilson, our longtime neighbor, still lived. She was the one who brought cookies to Mom every Christmas, the one Dad would help with plumbing repairs whenever her pipes leaked. I knocked on her door, and to my relief, a light flickered on inside. Mrs. Wilson, her hair white as snow, opened the door, her eyes narrowing as she recognized me. "Marvin? My goodness, is that really you?" She hugged me, but her eyes were filled with worry. "You're here for your parents, aren't you?" "Do you know where they are?" I asked, my voice hoarse. "Silas said they came back here, but the house is empty." Mrs. Wilson sighed, pulling me inside and pouring me a cup of warm water. "Isaac's in the hospital, Marvin. At Sacred Heart Medical Center. He's very sick. Eloise is there with him, staying by his side every day." She paused, looking at me as if she wanted to say more, but hesitated. "You should go there now. They need you." Her words struck me like a dagger to the heart. My father, the man as sturdy as an old oak who I'd never seen falter, was in the hospital? My legs felt weak, but I couldn't stay still. "Thank you," I said, my voice trembling, and rushed back to the car. Sacred Heart Medical Center was only 15 minutes away, but every second felt like an eternity. I drove through the dark streets, the hospital's lights appearing like a beacon in a storm. I parked hastily, nearly running into the main lobby, my breath ragged. The nurse at the reception desk looked up as I gave her the name, Isaac Monroe. She directed me to room 312, 3rd floor. The elevator moved agonizingly slowly, as if deliberately prolonging my anxiety. When the door to room 312 opened, I saw my mother sitting by the hospital bed, her frail hands clutching my father's. Dad lay there, his face pale, his eyes half closed, tubes snaking around his body. Mom looked up, and when she saw me, her eyes lit up, then filled with tears. "Marvin!" She stood, throwing herself into my arms, her small frame trembling against me. I held her tightly, feeling her fragility, her face gaunt from sleepless nights. "I'm here, Mom," I whispered, fighting back tears. "I'm sorry I'm late." I sat beside her, holding her hand, my eyes fixed on Dad. He was weaker than I'd imagined, his breathing slow and labored. "How's Dad doing?" I asked, my voice so low it was barely audible. Mom shook her head, her voice choked. The doctors say he has a lung infection compounded by exhaustion. He's been through a lot, Marvin. She paused, wiping tears with the back of her hand. But he's getting better. He just needs rest. I squeezed her hand, trying to stay calm. What happened, Mom? Silas said you two couldn't adjust to the penthouse and came back here. Why didn't anyone tell me? Why is Dad like this? Mom looked at me, her eyes filled with pain. She sighed as if summoning the strength to recount what she'd tried to bury. After you left for your tour, Silas and Heather asked to stay with us. They said their lease had ended, that they had nowhere to go. We agreed, thinking it was temporary, but her voice broke. Things weren't as you'd think, Marvin. My blood boiled, but I held it in, letting her continue. Her voice was slow, heavy with sorrow. At first, Silas and Heather seemed considerate. Silas helped Dad fix things around the house, and Heather cooked and made tea for Mom. They laughed and talked as if the family was reuniting. My parents, with their open hearts, believed Silas had changed, that he and Heather wanted to rebuild our family bond. But within weeks, things shifted. Silas started interfering with everything, Mom said, her hands trembling. He told us we didn't know how to live in a fancy apartment, that we were ruining things, that we didn't belong there. Heather always agreed, but never directly. She'd just watch, her eyes cold as if we were a burden. I listened, my heart feeling like it was being crushed. They dared to say that? I asked, my voice shaking with anger. That penthouse was mine to give you. They were guests, not the owners. Mom nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. Your father couldn't take it. He argued with Silas, said this was our home, that we had every right to be there. But Silas, he's not the brother you knew anymore. He said hurtful things, called us outdated, said we didn't deserve the place. Heather stood there silent, but her eyes, they agreed with him. I was stunned. Each word Mom spoke was like a cut tearing my heart apart. The penthouse, where I'd poured my heart into giving my parents a better life, had become a prison for them. I looked at Dad, the man who'd been our family's rock, now lying frail and helpless. I looked at Mom, the gentle woman who'd sewn my clothes, now worn down by pain and humiliation. Rage surged within me, mixed with guilt. I'd been gone too long, too caught up in the spotlight, leaving my parents to endure this. I'm sorry, I said, my voice choking. I didn't know this was happening. I'll make it right, Mom. I promise. Mom squeezed my hand, her eyes still gentle despite the pain. It's not your fault, Marvin. We just want you to be happy. But now that you're here, everything will be okay. I gripped Mom's hand tightly, fighting back tears, but every glance at Dad, entangled in tubes, his face pale and drawn, felt like a vice squeezing my heart. I needed to know what had happened, to understand why my parents, the people I loved most, had ended up in this situation. Mom, tell me, I said, my voice hoarse. What happened next? I tried to keep my tone steady, but inside anger simmered, waiting for a spark to ignite. Mom sighed, her gaze drifting as if pulling painful memories from a hidden corner. She continued, her voice increasingly choked with emotion. One stormy night, everything exploded. Rain poured outside like a deluge, thunder and lightning shaking the apartment's windows. Your father sat on the sofa, hands clasped tightly, trying to stay calm. But Silas stood in front of him, his voice full of accusations. It started with small things. Dad leaving his shoes in a corner, me forgetting to clear a plate from the table. But then, Silas couldn't hold back anymore. He shouted as if every frustration inside him came pouring out. Mom paused, her eyes lost in the distance, as if reliving that moment. He stood over your father, pointing, his voice trembling with anger. You always mess everything up. Do you think this is that run-down wooden house in Spokane? This is a penthouse, not a pigsty. Dad looked up, his eyes sharp but calm. Silas, he said, his voice low, this is my house. You're just a guest. Don't forget that. I pictured the scene and my heart felt crushed. My father, Isaac Monroe, the man who'd toiled fixing light bulbs to provide for us, who never raised his voice, was now facing insults from his own son. Mom continued, her voice trembling. Silas didn't stop. He stepped closer to Dad, his eyes flashing with contempt. Guest, he scoffed. You're backward, old-fashioned, clueless about living in a place like this. You think you deserve this apartment? An old electrician and a small-town housewife? Please go back to Spokane and leave us in peace. I gripped Mom's hand tighter, my nails digging into my palm. He dared to say that? I asked, my voice shaking with rage. Mom nodded, tears streaming down her face. Your father stood up, his face flushed. What did you say, Silas? He shouted, his voice echoing through the room. I raised you, gave you everything. And now you stand here insulting your parents? But Silas didn't back down. He yelled back, You don't belong here. Neither of you do. You're not good enough. Leave and stop bothering us. Mom said. Heather stood nearby, silent, but her cold gaze seemed to endorse every insult her husband hurled. Mom tried to intervene, grabbing Dad's hand, pleading, Silas, enough! We're family. But Silas brushed her off, his eyes dripping with disdain. Family? You're just a burden? Those words were like a final dagger, slicing deep into Dad's pride. Your father didn't say another word, Mom said, her voice breaking. He turned to me, his eyes full of pain but resolute. Eloise, he said, pride is the last thing we have. We're not staying here anymore. I tried to stop him, told him not to go, that it was storming outside. But he shook his head, his hands trembling. No, Eloise. We can't stay where our own son doesn't want us. Mom recounted how they packed in a hurry, grabbing only an old suitcase, a few clothes, and 2 worn-out raincoats. The penthouse door slammed shut behind them, the sound mingling with the thunder's roar. Outside, rain poured in sheets, the wind howling and shaking the skyscrapers. My parents, 2 elderly people in their 60s, trudged through the storm, their thin raincoats offering little protection. They stood by the roadside waiting for a taxi, but the storm had snarled traffic. No cabs stopped. Mom clung to Dad, trying to shield him from the rain, but both were soaked and freezing. I pictured it. My father shivering in the wind, my mother frantic but holding strong, and a sharp pain stabbed through me as if I were standing in the rain with them. The next morning, Mom continued, her voice barely a whisper, we returned to Spokane, to the old wooden house. Your father had a high fever, shaking, but he still tried to smile, telling me not to worry. But then, on the dusty road to the outskirts, he collapsed, clutching his chest, his face pale. I panicked, called an ambulance, and they brought him here. She paused, tears streaming down her face. The doctors said he had a minor stroke, brought on by the cold and exhaustion. I've been here ever since, caring for him day and night, praying he'll recover. I sat frozen. Every detail Mom shared was like a knife, tearing my heart apart. The penthouse, where I'd poured my heart into giving my parents a better life, had become a prison. Silas and Heather hadn't just taken the house. They'd stripped away my parents' dignity, driven them into a storm, and caused my father to collapse. I stood abruptly, pacing the hospital room, my fists clenched. The initial pain had transformed into burning rage. I saw my parents trudging through the rain, their thin raincoats soaked, walking in the dark, and the anger inside me blazed like an unquenchable fire. I'm sorry, I said, my voice choking, turning back to hold Mom's hand. I didn't know this was happening. I was gone too long. Tears welled up, but I wiped them away, not wanting Mom to see me weak. I'll make this right, Mom. I'll go back to Seattle, face Silas and Heather. I'll get justice for you and Dad. Mom looked at me, her gaze softening. You don't need to seek revenge, Marvin, she said, her voice frail. Just being here with us is enough. But I knew staying wasn't enough. Silas and Heather had gone too far, and I couldn't let them live comfortably in a home that wasn't theirs. My anger mixed with guilt, forging a razor-sharp resolve. I would return to Seattle, confront them, and I wouldn't stop until my parents reclaimed what they deserved. I kissed Mom's forehead, glancing at Dad once more. He lay there, frail but resilient, like an old oak weathering countless storms. I left the hospital room, stepping into the cold hallway. My footsteps echoed, blending with the pounding of my heart. This wasn't just about the penthouse. It was about my parents' dignity, our family bond, and my own sense of self. I wouldn't let Silas and Heather win. Never. The next few days I spent entirely at the hospital. I met with the doctor, a middle-aged woman with a calm voice, to understand Dad's condition. He had a minor stroke due to exposure and exhaustion, she said, pushing up her glasses. But with medication and rest, he'll recover. What he needs now is peace. Peace. The word cut into me like a knife. My parents had lost their peace because of Silas and Heather, and I wouldn't let that continue. I arranged everything to ensure my parents received the best care. I transferred a large sum to cover hospital bills, securing Dad a private room with state-of-the-art equipment. I hired a private nurse to assist Mom so she wouldn't have to bear the burden alone. Each morning I brought to the hospital the meals Mom loved, hot chicken soup, buttered toast, and sat with her, listening to her recount old stories about Spokane. Those moments, though simple, made me feel like I was reclaiming a piece of the family we'd lost. But every time I looked at Dad, entangled in tubes with his pale face, the anger inside me flared. Silas and Heather would pay. 4 days later, when the doctor confirmed Dad was past the critical phase, I kissed Mom's forehead, promised to return soon, and drove back to Seattle. I was no longer Marvin Monroe, the inspirational speaker with polished speeches. I was Marvin, the brother, the son, fueled by a fire of rage and a hunger for justice. The Marin residences loomed ahead as I entered downtown, its skyscraper aglow with lights, a symbol of opulence. But to me it was now a battlefield where I would confront Silas and Heather. I stepped into the lobby, the golden glow of crystal chandeliers reflecting off my black suit, as if reminding me of my status. But today I wasn't here as a successful speaker. I was here as a brother, a son, to demand justice. The elevator dinged softly, carrying me to the 42nd floor. The hallway was as luxurious as before, with the faint scent of lavender, but it couldn't calm the storm inside me. I stopped at the penthouse door, took a deep breath, and knocked. 3 firm, deliberate raps. The door swung open. Silas stood there in a wrinkled gray t-shirt, his expression a mix of surprise and irritation, as if I were an uninvited guest. Behind him, Heather was in the kitchen holding a dish towel, her eyes flicking over me before quickly dropping. The apartment was still pristine, gleaming, meticulously tidy, but the foreign smell of coffee and unfamiliar objects made my heart sink. Everything was as perfect as before, except it no longer held the warmth of my parents. Now it was just a beautiful apartment, not a home. I stepped inside, leaving my small suitcase by the door, my eyes scanning the room. The white leather sofa was still there, but now adorned with a garish red pillow Mom would never have chosen. The walnut dining table sparkled but bore no trace of family meals. The photo of the 4 of us was now upright, but it looked out of place among the unfamiliar decor. I turned to Silas, my voice low but restrained. "Dad's in the hospital, Silas. A minor stroke. Mom's exhausted from caring for him day and night." The room fell silent. Heather froze, the towel in her hand still. Silas frowned, trying to maintain his composure, but I saw his lips quiver slightly. What are you talking about?" he asked, feigning surprise, his eyes avoiding mine. Heather stepped closer, standing beside Silas as if forming a barrier between us. "Dad had a stroke because of exposure, because of exhaustion," I continued, my voice cold as ice. "After you 2 drove them out of this house. In a storm. 2 elderly people trudging through the rain with nowhere to go. That's what you did." Silence. A heavy, suffocating silence, as if the air in the room had thickened. Heather bowed her head, her gaze averted, but I saw her fingers tighten around the table's edge. Silas cleared his throat, trying to regain his confidence. "They chose to leave, Marvin," he said coolly. "We didn't force them. They said they couldn't adjust to living here. We just stayed. It's Mom and Dad's place, nothing wrong with that." I locked eyes with Silas, and for the first time I realized he was no longer the brother who once shared childhood dreams with me. Before me stood a stranger, his eyes wary, filled with the selfishness I never thought I'd see in him. "Mom and Dad's place," I repeated, my voice low but sharp. "This penthouse is mine, Silas. I bought it. It's in my name, and I gave it to Mom and Dad. Not you, not Heather. You have no right to be here, and I want you both out. Now." Heather interjected, her voice shaky but trying to sound confident. "We're just staying temporarily, Marvin. You don't need to make a big deal out of this. We'll find somewhere else." But her eyes, flickering with unease, betrayed her. She knew they were in the wrong but refused to admit it. I stepped closer to Silas, close enough that he had to look up at me. "You drove our parents onto the street," I said, each word carved from stone. "Dad nearly died. Mom's exhausted from worry, and you dare stand here saying nothing's wrong? If you don't leave, I'll take this to court. And I promise, Silas, I won't stop until you both pay." The room fell silent again. Silas opened his mouth, about to speak, but my glare stopped him. Heather grabbed his hand as if trying to pull him from this nightmare, but they both knew they had no way out. I didn't argue further. I turned, opened the door, and walked out. The door slammed behind me, the sound echoing in the quiet hallway. As the elevator carried me back to the lobby, one thing was clear. This wasn't just about a house. It was a battle between greed and dignity, between betrayal and family. Silas and Heather might have thought they won by taking the penthouse, but they'd lost something far more precious: my trust and our parents' love. I stepped out of the mirror, the city lights reflecting off my face. The anger still burned in my chest, but I'd forged it into a sharp blade. I wouldn't stop until my parents reclaimed what they deserved. As I stepped out of the Marin residences, Seattle's city lights reflected off rain-soaked puddles, glimmering but cold. The anger inside me still burned, but I had tamed it into clarity, a force to carry me through any obstacle. Silas and Heather might think they were safe in the penthouse, but I wouldn't let them rest easy for another day. I drove straight to downtown Seattle, to the office of Michael Grant, my lawyer who had handled the penthouse purchase 2 years ago. In my hand was a briefcase containing every document related to the apartment, from the purchase agreement to the transfer records. I believed that proving ownership would be enough to evict Silas and Heather, just as they had driven my parents out. Michael's office was on the 15th floor of a sleek glass building overlooking Seattle's skyline. I stepped inside, the cool air from the AC soothing the heat in my head. Michael, a man in his 50s with silver-streaked hair, greeted me with a friendly smile but sharp eyes. "Marvin, it's been a while," he said, gesturing to the leather chair across his desk. "You don't look good. What's going on?" I set the briefcase on the desk and slid it toward him. "I need your help to take back the penthouse at the Mirren," I said, my voice firm. "My brother Silas and his wife Heather are occupying it. They drove my parents out and I want them gone immediately." Michael raised an eyebrow, opened the briefcase, and flipped through the pages. I recounted everything, from returning to find my parents gone, to Mom's story in the hospital about the stormy night when Silas insulted them and forced them out. Each word cut into my heart again, but I didn't stop. I needed Michael to grasp the gravity of the situation. "The apartment is in my name," I stressed. "I bought it, I paid for it, and I gave it to my parents. Silas has no right to be there." Michael nodded, but his expression grew pensive. He studied the documents, jotting notes on a small pad, then leaned back in his chair with a sigh. "Marvin, I understand you're angry and you have every reason to be. But this situation isn't as straightforward as you think." I frowned, feeling the floor shift beneath me. "Not straightforward? What do you mean?" "I'm the owner, I have the paperwork. Just order them out." Michael shook his head, placing the documents on the desk. "You're not the sole owner, Marvin. The apartment is under co-ownership between you and your father, Isaac Monroe. Remember when we added his name to the deed to secure long-term rights for your parents? I nodded, but my heart began to race. Michael continued, "Right now, Isaac is in the hospital, correct? He's not in a condition to sign any power of attorney or consent to property decisions. Without his approval, you can't make unilateral decisions about the apartment." I clenched my fists, nails digging into my palms. So I wait for Dad to recover. But what about Silas and Heather? They have no right to be there. They drove my parents out. Michael raised a hand, signaling me to calm down. "Legally," he said, his voice steady, "since Silas and Heather were initially allowed to stay by your parents, they're considered permitted residents, not trespassers. That means you can't evict them immediately without a legal process. If you change the locks or force them out, they could even sue you for violating their residency rights." His words hit like a punch to the face. I stood abruptly, pacing the office, frustration and helplessness surging like a wave. "What do you mean?" I nearly shouted. "The house I bought that I paid for is now protecting those ungrateful people. They drove my parents onto the street, Michael. My father almost died." Michael looked at me, his gaze both sympathetic and stern. "I understand, Marvin. But the law doesn't care about emotions. It cares about documents and procedures. The only way to resolve this is to issue a formal notice to Silas and Heather, requiring them to vacate within the legal time frame, typically 30 days. Meanwhile, you'll need to wait for your father to recover and sign a power of attorney. Then we can file a court order to enforce their eviction if they don't comply." I sank back into the chair, feeling like the world was against me. The penthouse, my pride, had become a legal trap. Silas and Heather, who had hurt my parents, were protected by the law because of my parents' naive decision to let them stay. I looked out the window at Seattle's glowing skyscrapers, but they only made me feel suffocated. "So what do I do now?" I asked, my voice low, almost desperate. Michael tapped his pen on the desk, thinking. "Don't act rashly, Marvin. Don't enter the apartment, don't change the locks, don't confront them directly. Any misstep could worsen the situation legally. I'll draft the eviction notice today and send it to them. In the meantime, stay calm and wait for your father's recovery. That's the only legal path." I nodded, but inside I knew I couldn't just sit and wait. I thanked Michael, left his office, and drove out of downtown. I stopped by Lake Union, where the water shimmered with reflections of distant boat lights. A cold wind blew through, but it couldn't cool the anger inside me. I looked at the lake, my face distorted in the rippling water. I had thought the law would be my weapon, but now it was a barrier. Silas and Heather were still living comfortably in the penthouse while my father lay in a hospital bed and my mother was exhausted. But I wouldn't give up. If the law couldn't help me now, I'd use reason and strategy. I'd make Silas and Heather leave one way or another. I swore I would. I returned to the Myron residences early one morning, as the first light of dawn painted Seattle's sky a soft pink. I didn't knock or announce myself. As a co-owner, I had a key, and I had the right. The penthouse door opened with a soft click, and I stepped inside, carrying a small suitcase with a few clothes and my laptop. The apartment was still pristine, but it was no longer a home. It was a battlefield. Silas was lounging on the sofa, scrolling through his phone while Heather was in the kitchen brewing coffee. At the sound of the door, both jolted and turned to me. Silas sprang up, his expression a mix of surprise and irritation. "Marvin? What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice rising as if I were an intruder. I gave a faint smile, but my eyes were cold as ice. "This is my house, Silas. I'm staying here. Any problem with that?" Without waiting for a response, I pulled my suitcase into the living room, set it on the floor, and opened my laptop on the walnut dining table. Heather stepped out of the kitchen, still holding her coffee mug, her gaze sweeping over me with wariness. I said nothing more, just played a soft jazz tune through a Bluetooth speaker, the music filling the room, loud enough to disrupt their peace, but not enough for them to complain. Over the next few days, I made my presence an invisible pressure. I didn't raise my voice or cause a scene, but I was always there at the right moment. Early in the morning, while Silas and Heather were still asleep, I turned on the living room lights, opened my laptop and worked, the steady tapping of keys echoing in the quiet space. In the evenings, I used the kitchen, cooking a simple meal, the aroma of grilled meat and herbs wafting through, a reminder that this was my space. Silas tried to act unfazed, but I saw his hands clench whenever I opened the fridge or sat on the sofa. Heather avoided my gaze, but her irritation showed in stolen glances and suppressed sighs. I didn't stop there. One morning, I called a maintenance team to inspect the apartment's electrical, plumbing, and HVAC systems, citing routine upkeep. The sound of drills and hammers filled the air from early morning, while Silas and Heather were still yawning in their bedroom. "What's all this, Marvin?" Silas snapped, his hair disheveled, as the crew began removing a ceiling panel to check the wiring. "The apartment needs maintenance," I replied calmly. "I don't want it falling apart." "You don't mind, do you?" Silas said nothing, just turned away, but I saw his jaw tighten. The maintenance work dragged on for 3 days with constant noise and workers coming and going. Heather complained she couldn't work from home, but I just shrugged. This is my house. I have to make sure everything's in order. The inconvenience began to seep into their lives like slow drips filling a cup. Next, I contacted the building management requesting all bills, electricity, water, internet, be transferred to my name. From now on, any repairs, maintenance, or even turning on the heater required my approval. One evening, when Silas tried to turn on the heating system, it didn't work. He called the management only to be told, "You need to contact Mr. Marvin Monroe, the owner." I saw Silas throw his phone onto the sofa, his face red with anger. "What are you doing, Marvin?" he yelled. I looked back, my voice even. "Just making sure everything follows procedure." I also hired a professional cleaning company to tidy the apartment regularly, always scheduling them for early mornings, right when Silas and Heather liked to sleep in. The hum of vacuum cleaners, the clatter of buckets, and the cheerful chatter of the cleaning crew started at 6 a.m. Heather appeared at the bedroom door in a robe, hair a mess, her eyes blazing with resentment. "Can't you let us have some peace, Marvin?" she asked, her voice trembling. I smiled lightly. "I just want the apartment clean. My parents like things tidy." Each of my actions was small, reasonable, and entirely within my rights. But they piled up, like stones weighing down on Silas and Heather. The atmosphere in the apartment grew tense, stifling. I overheard their arguments through the thin walls, Silas shouting about losing control, Heather complaining about the inconvenience. "I can't take this anymore," I heard her yell one evening after the cleaning crew had left. Silas snapped back, his voice thick with frustration. "He's doing it on purpose, but we can't do anything about it." I sat in the living room pretending to read, but a faint smirk tugged at my lips. They were feeling the same suffocation they'd inflicted on my parents. Alongside this plan, I stayed in touch with Michael Grant, my lawyer. I called him daily, ensuring the eviction notice had been sent to Silas and Heather and that the legal paperwork was being meticulously prepared. Michael urged me to stay patient, reminding me that my father needed time to recover and sign the power of attorney. But I couldn't just wait. Each night I slept little, worked long hours, my eyes glued to my laptop screen, plotting my next steps. I wasn't seeking revenge with anger or violence. I was making Silas and Heather feel the consequences of their actions. Those days I lived in a strange state, calm on the outside but taut as a wire inside. I knew one misstep could unravel everything. Yet every time I thought of my parents, two elderly people trudging through a storm, soaked in flimsy raincoats, I found the strength to keep going. Silas and Heather might think they held the upper hand, but I would make them realize that in this battle I wouldn't back down. The weeks that followed in the penthouse were a silent but fierce battle of wits. I maintained a calm exterior, but every action, whether the jazz music playing in the early mornings, the hum of the cleaning crew's vacuums, or the comings and goings of the maintenance team, was a stone hurled at Silas and Heather's complacency. I saw them begin to unravel. Silas no longer lounged on the sofa scrolling through his phone. Instead, he paced the living room, his eyes filled with anxiety. Heather grew irritable, slamming kitchen cabinets when I appeared. They didn't say it aloud, but I knew. They were feeling the same suffocation they had once inflicted on my parents. My silence kept them awake at night. Through the thin walls of the apartment, I heard their heated whispers. "He's doing it on purpose, Silas," Heather snapped one night, her voice trembling with anger. "We can't live like this forever." Silas responded, his tone thick with frustration. "I know, but we can't do anything about it unless—" His sentence trailed off, but I didn't need to hear the rest. They were scared, and their fear was my weapon. No more direct arguments, no more challenges. Just exhaustion and mounting tension, like a guitar string stretched to the breaking point. Meanwhile, in Spokane, my father was slowly recovering. I called Mom every day, hearing her voice grow lighter than before. She told me Dad could now sit up, talk, and even crack jokes like he used to. "He says he misses the old wooden chair at home," she said with a soft laugh. "He complained the hospital is too clean but too cold, not like our home." I smiled along, but my heart remained heavy. My parents deserved peaceful days, not months of pain caused by Silas and Heather. One afternoon, I drove back to Spokane to see Dad. He had been moved to a recovery room, his face still pale but his eyes brighter. When I walked in, he looked at me and nodded slightly. "You're back," he said, his voice weak but still warm as I remembered it. I sat by his bedside, held his hand, and told him everything. About Silas, Heather, and my plan to reclaim the penthouse. Dad listened without interrupting, his eyes filled with pain. When I finished, he was silent for a long time, then sighed. "Marvin," he said, "I don't blame Silas. He's my son, but I'm disappointed." Those words cut into me. My father, the resilient man who'd endured a lifetime of hardship, was left with nothing but hurt. The next day, I contacted Michael Grant, my lawyer. "Dad's strong enough to sign the papers," I said over the phone, my voice firm. "Prepare the authorization documents and come to the hospital immediately." Michael didn't hesitate. That afternoon, he arrived at Sacred Heart Medical Center with a thick stack of documents. In the hospital room with Mom by his side, Dad took the pen, his hands trembling but his gaze steady, and signed the full power of attorney, granting me control over the penthouse. "Do what's right, Marvin," he said, his voice low but resolute. I nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on my shoulders, but also a promise I had to keep. A few days later, a formal notice was sent to Silas and Heather demanding they vacate the apartment within 7 days. I wasn't there when Michael delivered it, but I could imagine the scene. Silas, his face paling, clutching the paper as he read each line with growing panic. Heather, standing beside him, perhaps bowing her head to hide her unease. They didn't resist, didn't call me, didn't offer any explanations. 7 days later, they left, silent as ghosts. When I returned to the penthouse, it was empty, save for the smell of cleaning solution and a few forgotten items. A cracked mug, an old pair of shoes. No apologies, no words. They had lost, but my victory brought no joy, only a cold void. I returned to Spokane, where Dad had been discharged and was back in the old wooden house. He sat in his familiar wooden chair, holding a cup of tea, his gaze fixed on the wildflower field outside. Mom was in the kitchen, bustling about preparing dinner, the scent of cookies wafting through, taking me back to childhood. I sat beside Dad, took a deep breath, and said, "Mom, Dad, I've taken back the penthouse. It's yours? I want you to return to Seattle, live there as we planned." Dad looked at me, his eyes gentle but firm. "Marvin," he said slowly, "that house is no longer a home. It's beautiful, but it's just walls filled with sad memories." He paused, gazing at the field. "Here, though simple, I feel at peace." Mom stepped out, placing a plate of cookies on the table and taking my hand. "I agree with your father," she said softly. "Spokane is home. The old neighbors, the old roads, the apple tree out there, they make me feel warmer than any fancy apartment ever could." I fell silent, looking at my parents, my heart heavy yet relieved. I understood that no material thing could heal their wounds. The penthouse, once my pride, was now just a painful memory. I nodded slightly, holding Mom's hand. "I understand," I said, my voice catching. "I just want you to be happy." Dad patted my shoulder, a rare smile crossing his lips. "You've done enough, Marvin. Now let it go." His words were a reminder. Sometimes victory isn't about reclaiming what was lost, but about letting go to hold on to what truly matters. I sat in the old wooden house in Spokane, the light from an old oil lamp casting a warm glow on my parents' faces lined with the wrinkles of time and pain. They had refused to return to the Seattle penthouse, and I understood why. That house, though once my pride, was now a hollow shell filled with painful memories. I couldn't force them back to a place that had cast them out, where Silas and Heather had turned family into betrayal. But I also couldn't let the penthouse stand as a scar, reminding me of my failure to protect my parents. Returning to Seattle, I stepped into the penthouse one final time. The air was still clean but cold, as if its soul had left with my parents. I stood before the large glass window, looking down at the city twinkling with lights. The skyscrapers, the bustling traffic, and the distant Puget Sound, once symbols of the success I chased, now left me feeling empty. I walked through each room, touching the white leather sofa, the walnut dining table, the small family photo on the shelf. Each item stirred memories, not of happy days, but of the stormy night when my parents trudged away. I knew I had to let go, not because I needed the money, but because I needed to sever the tie to this painful past. I contacted a reputable real estate agency to sell the penthouse. The agent, a young woman with a professional smile, was surprised I wanted to part with such a prime property. "Are you sure, Mr. Marvin?" she asked, her voice tinged with regret. "This apartment is a dream for anyone in Seattle." I nodded, offering no explanation. She didn't need to know that for me it was no longer a dream, but a reminder of what I'd lost. The sale happened quickly. A wealthy family from California bought the penthouse for more than I'd expected. As I signed the contract, I felt no regret, only relief. With the proceeds, I decided to invest in something meaningful, building a community center in Spokane, where I was born, where my parents now lived, where my childhood memories remained intact. I wanted to transform pain into purpose, to create a place where people, especially those who'd been forgotten, could find hope. I returned to Spokane with a plan and a new fire. I partnered with local authorities, securing a vacant plot on the outskirts, a former wildflower field where Silas and I used to play ball as kids. I funded the project myself, hiring architects and a construction team to design a 2-story building named the Bennett Family Center, inspired by my mother's maiden name as a tribute to her. During the months of construction, I often returned home for dinner with my parents. Those meals were simple but warm, with Mom bustling about making mashed potatoes and roast, and Dad recounting old Spokane stories, tales of fixing light bulbs to provide for us. "You don't need to go this far, Marvin," Dad said once, his voice low. "But I'm proud of you." Mom smiled, resting her hand on mine, her eyes seeming to make up for the years we'd lost. The construction wasn't easy. Heavy rains delayed progress, disputes with contractors arose over costs, and some nights I stayed up, worrying if I was doing the right thing. But each time I saw my parents, their smiles slowly returning, I knew I couldn't stop. The community center wasn't just a building. It was my promise that they'd never be hurt again. The center's grand opening coincided with Dad's 64th birthday. The Spokane sky was clear that day, golden sunlight spilling over the wildflower field, glinting off the sign in front of the building, Bennett Family Center. Dedicated to those who've been forgotten and to those who believe kindness can start anew. Locals gathered in droves, laughter filling the small courtyard. Children ran and played, adults chatted animatedly, and the smell of fresh-baked bread wafted from the food stall. My parents stood by the sign, Mom holding Dad's hand, both smiling, their eyes shining with pride. I kept my speech brief. When invited to the stage, I stood there looking at the crowd, at my parents, and said simply, "This place isn't mine. It belongs to those who need a home, a chance, a fresh start. Thank you to my parents, who taught me that love and kindness are always worth fighting for." The crowd applauded, but I didn't need their cheers. I only needed to see my parents' smiles, to see them standing there at peace among old neighbors. From then on, I regularly held talks at the center, helping young people navigate careers, teaching communication skills, and sharing my own story. I spoke of my journey, my mistakes, the pain of seeing my parents hurt, and how I found meaning by building this place. Spokane became home. No more city lights, no more lavish apartments, just people, memories, and true peace. Each time I stood before the center, watching the sign gleam in the sunlight, I knew I'd found where I truly belonged. I once thought the Penthouse was a symbol of success, of the filial devotion I had for my parents. Its gleaming glass walls, white leather sofa, and sweeping city views were like a promise that I could make up for our family's years of hardship. But standing before the Bennett Family Center, amid children's laughter and my parents' warm gazes, I realized a house doesn't make a home. It's love, respect, and simple moments together that form the true foundation. The Penthouse was now just a memory, a costly lesson about what I'd let slip away while chasing the spotlight. In the days after selling the Penthouse, I reflected on my journey. I had once been consumed by anger, determined to make Silas and Heather pay at all costs. But seeing my parents smile in the old wooden house, hearing Dad tell stories over a cup of tea, watching Mom bustle in the kitchen with the scent of cookies wafting through, I understood that anger wasn't the answer. Money could buy comforts, luxury apartments, first-class flights, but it couldn't buy peace. Forgiveness, I realized, wasn't weakness. It was the only way to let go of pain, to move forward without being dragged back by the weight of the past. Success to me was no longer about owning more, but about using what I had to heal and share. The community center was proof of that. Each week I held talks there, not as a famous speaker, but as a man who'd made mistakes, lost precious things, and was now trying to rebuild. I spoke to young people about career paths and communication skills, but above all, I shared my own story. I told them about our poor days in Spokane, about my parents' lifelong sacrifices to raise me and Silas, about the pain of learning they'd been driven from the Penthouse, and about how I found meaning by building this place. The audience listened. Some nodded, some wiped tears. I knew my story wasn't just mine. It belonged to anyone who'd ever let important relationships slip through their hands. During my final talk at the center, as the sunset bathed the courtyard in gold, I stood before the crowd, microphone in hand, but my voice was no longer that of a speaker. It was the voice of a son, a brother, a man who'd learned a harsh lesson about family. "Don't wait until you lose your loved ones to realize they're the most precious thing," I said, my gaze sweeping over my parents, sitting in the front row, hand in hand. Life can sweep us away with work, ambition, or city lights. But if one day you have it all, remember to rebuild the relationships you've neglected, because those are the treasures that never fade. The crowd applauded, but I didn't need their cheers. I looked at Dad, saw him nod slightly, his eyes full of pride. I looked at Mom, saw her smile, her eyes glistening with joy. That was all I needed. As the talk ended, I stepped into the courtyard, standing before the community center where the Bennett Family Center sign gleamed in the sunset. I sat on a wooden bench, feeling Spokane's cool breeze. The sunset descended, painting the sky a fiery red, like the anger that once burned in me now softened into peace. I smiled, realizing peace isn't something you find. It's something you create when you know what's enough and how to love. The days of anger, the battles with Silas and Heather, the sleepless nights worrying about my parents, all had led me to this moment. I was no longer Marvin Monroe, the celebrated speaker with dazzling talks. I was just Marvin, the son of Isaac and Eloise, who'd found a true home among simple people and honest memories. And I knew no matter where life took me, Spokane would always be where I returned, where I belonged.